So thank you for coming out. So chapter 12, of course, leads on from chapter 11, where we've spent the last few weeks looking at the heroes of the faith. You remember by faith they did this and that and the other thing. So now we're picking up in chapter 12. So, is Robbie here? No. Oh, there you are. You going to read for me? Robbie, could you read to verse 13, please? 1 to 13. Thank you.
Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father? And do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a while, for a little while, as they thought best. But God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, he produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by him. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and be peace. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather be.
Thanks, Robbie. Okay, that could be a bit high. Is that okay? Good. Okay, so one of the things you'll notice in tonight's study is the importance of context. And I hope you've already seen that a little bit as we've gone through Hebrews. That sometimes if you look at a verse and you take it in isolation, you can think it means something, but actually when you examine it within its context, it means something completely different. We saw an example of that on Sunday actually in 1 Peter 3, where we're told to always be ready to give a defense of the hope that is within us. And that's often been used in isolation as a verse for evangelism. But within the context, it's much more about being ready for if ever you're persecuted and have to challenged to keep or deny the faith. So we're going to see some of that again tonight and see how important it is. So as Robbie read, we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, and we're told to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily ensnares us. So, pardon me, what does the great cloud of witnesses testify to? Right, remember, they're all dead now, they're all gone, but they're presently testifying to us. Well, the first thing we notice is that they ran their race with perseverance. Okay, so you see there, and let us run with perseverance, the race marked out for us. So perseverance is really the key, because in Hebrews, these people did have faith, and many of them might still have faith, but they're losing their faith. And the key is you've got to persevere. Faith is not going to be rewarded until you have it to the end. It's no good having it at the beginning. It's not how you start the race. It's how you complete. So you could actually call this book an exhortation to faith and perseverance in that faith. It's the first thing we notice. And then he says that what they testify to is that they threw off the sin that so easily entangles. Okay? So they threw off the sin that so easily entangles. So just, I'm going to follow Paul's lead here and ask you to speak to the person next to you and tell them what sin easily entangles you. Now, not your second worst sin or your third worst sin, but your worst sin, the one that always besets you, the one that you're being called to throw off. So, and don't hold back, just share exactly. If you could, you don't want to do that? All right, you might not want to do that. Now, okay, I don't blame you if you... I'd be prepared to do it, but not on the videotape. Okay, so this is why context is so important, because if you look at that, it says to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that easily ensnares. What comes to your mind straight away? Right? Hold that thought, not too long, but something would have come to your mind, okay? What is the writer talking about? Is he talking about that, your individual personal weakness? Or is he talking about something else? So let's see what it is. He says that they fixed their eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Okay? So these are the things that these people are testifying to. They ran the race with perseverance, they threw off the sin that easily entangles, and they fixed their eyes on Jesus. Okay? So just to round off that last statement, faith begins with Jesus and is completed by Jesus. Okay, this is very similar to something that Paul says in Romans 1:17. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. So it begins with faith and it ends with faith. It is not faith and works, it is faith and faith. You begin with faith, you end with faith. You're always driven because Jesus is the completer, the author, and the completer of the faith. Huh? So, we also see that Jesus, in that section, it says he endured much scorn. I'm going to get back to that thing that I've aroused your interest in. But he endured much scorn and shame, but threw it off to receive the prize. You see it says there, we have to fix our eyes on Jesus, who for the joy set before him, right? So he had a prize, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. So Jesus is the example. He's not just the Saviour who does it all, but he's also the example for how to endure, as are the saints from chapter 11. He endured much scorn and shame. And again, remember, these people in that first century are becoming embarrassed about being Christian. They want to turn away. They can no longer share it with their neighbours. Maybe they put, a Hanukkah out the front of their house or something so that the Jews don't hate them. They're sort of looking for ways to fit into the society because they're now becoming embarrassed by Jesus. But Jesus does not scorn. He endured much scorn and shame, but he threw it off. He cast it off. So did those guys in chapter 11. Remember, they went around in goat skins and sheep skins. They lived in caves. They were persecuted from place to place. They had no home. There was no place on earth that they could call their own. They looked for something better. All right? So that's the picture we got. He says, remember Jesus, consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men. Remember Jesus who endured great opposition and endured in spite of it. He was able to reach his end because he endured the thing. Then in verse 4, the next verse, he says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Okay, so these people, pardon me, these people have been persecuted, they're going through a tough time, but they're not yet being martyred. All right? They're not yet actually shedding blood, but we know they're getting their possessions confiscated, they're being alienated in trade, they're losing reputation, they're suffering shame, all of those things. Now, you'll notice in the green sections that I've highlighted sin there, and this is quite important. So the question is, what sin is being spoken of here? What kind of struggle against sin was result in the shedding of blood? Now, you remember the question, when I offered to, which you were ungrateful and unwilling to participate in, but when I gave you the opportunity to share the sin that entangles you. So now we're actually asking, with what sin is this writer thinking about? What is he thinking about when he uses the word sin here in the context of the passage? Why is the context so important? Any thoughts? It ultimately is unbelief. It's a struggle against unbelief. But can you see in the second reference, who endured much opposition from sinful men? In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Now, think about your favourite sin. Is there ever any chance that you would shed blood in your desire to resist it? It's unlikely, isn't it? Okay? So, what sin could he possibly be talking about? I believe it's the apostasy of those outside who are trying to put pressure on them to leave. These are the ones who are setting the snare. Jesus faced opposition from sinful men who scorned him, mocked him, shamed him, crucified him, but he endured it. So did these guys. So he says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily ensnares. The sin that easily ensnares is the trap to give in to Judaism, give in to the societal pressures, turn your back on Jesus. You see, that's the very point of this. He's calling upon them not to turn their back on Jesus. That's the sin that very easily seems to entangle Christians in that first century, whose eyes go back to Jerusalem and says, and where they say the high priest is really pretty good. And God did make a lot of promises about the high priest. So that's where their eyes are going, saying, that's a snare. It traps you, and you've got to cast it off. So Do you see the point? I didn't give much opportunity for discussion there, but just to make the point, the context is not about your personal weakness, but the universal thing that he's talking about here that drives people ultimately away from Christ himself. And through embarrassment, shame, lack of trade, whatever, causes you to start to withdraw from Jesus, to get cool, to start to drift away. Okay? The sin of those who oppose the church and persecute them. That is the sin they are to resist. The sin of those who oppose the church and persecute them. It's their sin. It's that they are the sinful men. That is the sin that entangles. You see? So you've got to look at it within the context. It takes a little bit of nuancing, but that's why it's important to meditate and look at the whole passages together. Okay, any thought or question on that?
I was just going to say, also I read, you have not resisted sin to the point of shedding blood. I already, like the picture that came to mind was Jesus when he was sweating blood and wanting to maybe not go to the cross. I don't know, that was what I always associated with. But,
Yeah, well, but I think it's sort of being pilloried, like clearly the oppression of the sinful people has not been so great as yet that they are actually being flogged or martyred, as they are in other parts of the Christian world at this time. Hasn't started happening in this part, which I think is Alexandria in North Africa. But you get the point. Does it help to see that context? Okay, so he goes on then, the next section that Robbie read for us on the discipline, which addresses you as sons. And this is a tough passage, actually. He says, and you have forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as sons. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. Don't lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes everyone he accepts as a son. Okay? Now, the words he's telling them not to forget are actually taken from Proverbs. Okay? So these are Proverbs. This is from Proverbs chapter 3. In fact, there's several references in this passage taken from Proverbs 3 and 4. Interestingly, and it's always helpful, we did it again on Sunday because Peter in chapter 3, he had Psalm 34 in front of him, that's what he's quoting from, and that's where he's getting his allusions from. Here, the Hebrews writer has got Proverbs 3 and 4 in front of him. He directly quotes that section, right? And the point is that we ought not to trivialize the discipline. So these guys are going through suffering, and what they're saying is, this suffering is getting us nowhere, let's go back. They're trivializing it. For the Hebrews writer, the suffering is actually good. It's actually a good thing. He says not to lose heart when God rebukes you. So he's not saying this is pressure coming from outside in the community. He's not adopting a posture of saying, well, God would help if he could. No, as far as he's concerned, God's not only allowing this to happen, but even bringing it on for them. Don't lose heart when he rebukes you. The suffering they're going through is, the headstream of it is God. Not the devil, not the world, but God is bringing suffering upon people. He says he instructs or punishes those he loves. Right? And the next verse, he whips or scourges everyone he accepts as a son. And the Greek word there for scourge is the same word for Jesus being whipped. You want to be accepted as a son? You think you're going to be a Christian without suffering? Think again. You see, it's inescapable. You could say, oh, I'll make myself rich, I'll build a big fence, I'll have lots of food, I'll only have the people that I like in my gate. No. No matter who you are in the world, no matter how rich, no matter how much influence you have, you're still going to suffer. There's no escape. There's no escaping it. We can pretend that we can escape it, but there is no escape. But for Christians, the same is true. And God will actually cause his children to suffer. And rather than this being a negative, it's actually an enormous positive. Because for him, he's saying that everyone God accepts, he scourges as sons. Right? So, of course, there's a lot of theology bouncing around. It says that Christians should have a good life. Your best life now. Everything should be good. You should have nice children. And don't expect it in this life. There's no escaping the troubles and the discipline of God. But it's a sign that we have been accepted. Now, those who believe that Christians should avoid suffering and have a great blessed life, those who believe that would reject this idea. But this is actually evidence. This is designed to encourage us. If you suffer, don't see it as God being against you. Understand it as God being for you. That's what he's saying here. If you suffer, it's because God is for you. He is treating you like his own children. You see the point of it? So he says, endure suffering as discipline. That is how God treats his children. Right? What son is not disciplined by his father? If you are not disciplined, you are not legitimate. Therefore, no suffering, no security. I caught the tail end of a generation, a Christian generation that understood that raising children, the best person at it was a guy called James Dobson, who in the United States started a ministry. I can't even remember the name of it now. Focus on the family, that's it. And anyway, very big feature of it was you've got to discipline your children when they're young. You've got to straighten them out when they're very little. And there's multiple advantages. Like, if you say to your child, stop, they need to be able to stop and not find that a point of negotiation, because you could actually save your child's life. There was one time when we were in France and I called out to Katie. She ran out in front of a car and I called out to her and she responded instantly and it saved her life. And if she hadn't, honestly, we were jet lagged. We flew from Australia where everything is on the other side of the road. We drove 150 miles out of Paris. I got out of the car, I walked across the street, Katie started to follow me. And of course, we're looking the wrong way for cars. And it just happened, this car came flying along. And I called out, Katie! And she leaped and got out of the way of this car. It was just amazing. And we think it was an almost borderline miracle. But I think there are times like that, and you see it. Sometimes you've got to be able to say to your children, you've got to discipline them to that extent, that they've got to be able to respond quickly to what you say, in a way. But not only that, children who don't have good discipline in their lives, they're very insecure. A lot of emotional security comes by parental discipline. And it's just I think that's what I've experienced. Some people might disagree, but I think that was the teaching, that was the education. But now everyone feels like, oh no, everything has to be negotiated. You have to negotiate everything with a child. Why can't I have that bag of lollies? Well, let me explain it to you. See here, all this sugar, it'll get to your kidneys, and and when you're 42, you're going to have psoriasis of the liver. No, you just say no. That's it. No negotiation. You know, and children are, they're terrorists. They're little terrorists. They'll do whatever you let them. But they're secure if you discipline them. So, for the writer, he says, discipline led to the respect of our earthly fathers. How much more will this discipline lead us to respect the Father of our spirits who is in heaven? Discipline is never pleasant, but it will pay off with a harvest of righteousness for those trained in it. Okay, so any thoughts or discussion? I'll stop there for a minute. Justin.
Seems like the writer of Hebrews is making this connection between opposition from sinners as part of the Lord's discipline,
Yeah.
as well as any other hardships as well.
Yeah, well, he does say, Robbie, your eyes might fall on it before me. Oh, in verse 7, endure hardship as discipline. So that's a universal. So he says, endure hardship as discipline. I think that can be sickness, it could be financial struggles, it could be a toothache. Endure it, but also opposition, being ridiculed, whatever. I think it's all part of a package that we should understand is what God is bringing into our lives. Do you remember in 1 Peter as well, I think it was it 1 Peter 2, Paul, or was it 1, where he talked about suffering being from God to test the worthiness of your faith. So that your faith can be demonstrated to be true. Because if you take a lot of assaulting because of your faith, why on earth would you keep it unless it was real? But if your faith was false, wouldn't you put it out with the rubbish? You see, in other words, so the suffering is intended to show the great worth of our faith, which endures and is more refined than gold, which perishes. Right? So that's Peter. So it's the same kind of concept. So any other thoughts or anything there with the suffering or Justin?
Sinful men, you sort of made the point that nowadays there's a lot of people preaching almost the opposite, where we deserve a good life and to be blessed. Would you put those people in the category of?
Not necessarily, but they're not the ones actually assaulting the faith. But what they're doing is they're not preparing people for the troubles. I always think, if you've made a meal, not you specifically, but like if you make a meal and you're not sure how it's going to work out, right? You'll always hedge a bit. You say, this might not be to everyone's taste. In other words, you prepare people for possibly not liking it. What you don't have to prepare people for is liking it. So when you see Jesus, he sent out his disciples. And how did he prepare them? He prepared them with every possible negative. You'll be hounded from town to town. You'll be ridiculed. You'll be wherever you go, He doesn't say, hey, and when you get to Bethsaida, you ought to eat the cheesecake there. There's a little place and they're going to welcome you in and give you a cup of coffee. He doesn't say any of the positives, and I'm sure there were lots of positives. But you don't have to prepare people for the positives. The positive is its own reward. None of them came back and said, gee, you told us it was all going to be negative, and it was good out there. Nobody complains about that. They'll complain if you said everything's going to be good out there and they come back and say, it wasn't all good out there. Then they'll complain. So you have to prepare people for the worst. And I think that's what Jesus does with the disciples. And I think we have to be prepared for the worst. If you constantly tell people that God's going to heal them, make them well, make them prosperous, pay their bills, do this and this, it doesn't happen. Who do you think falls away? You know, who falls away when the cancer comes? Or the child dies? Or I really thought that God was telling me that I was going to marry that person. And then you next thing you know, you're eating wedding cake at that person's wedding. You know, it happens all the time. You know, so you can't just expect God to bless your life. It's better to be prepared for the worst. All right? If I'm going to take out a road crew to work for 8 hours, I'm going to say it's going to be really hard work. We're going to be in the sun. You know, it's going to be relentless. We're going to be digging with shovels. You know, get a good night's sleep. Right? If I stop after an hour and say, okay, everybody, here's some milkshakes, nobody's going to complain. So you prepare people for the worst. And any other thoughts or? Yeah, we'll see as we get down in this passage a bit more that there's a corporate dimension to this. It's not just about individuals. It's about the church itself. It's about the church. And if you don't clean the church, you know, the marks of the church are the preaching of the word, the sacraments, and discipline. They're the three main marks of the church. Okay, so if the church doesn't discipline, if you've got people in the church who are contradicting the message or thwarting the message or alienating the message from people, you've got to deal with that. That's part of the pastoral thing. If there's somebody in the church, for instance, who's getting around to everybody and saying, listen, you know, it's not really what he's saying, and, you know, Jesus isn't really God, he's just an angel. We've got to talk to that person, say, listen, you're welcome to come, but you're not welcome to try to attack the sheep. You know? So you can come, but you can't say these things to the people in the church. That's part of the protective role. So I think there's a harvest of righteousness to be gleaned by the community in this instance. And you'll see as we get into this. Okay, so the next part of that verse, in verse 12, I think it is, he says, therefore strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame will not be disabled, but rather healed. Okay, therefore lift your drooping hands and strengthen weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame, So that quote there, make level paths for your feet, again, is taken from Proverbs 3 or 4? 4. Yeah, so it's a direct quote from Proverbs 4. So again, he's got his eye on Proverbs 4, right? So he's in that part of the world. He's saying, lift your drooping hands, strengthen weak knees, make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. So he's talking about Christians who are stumbling, who are getting weak, right? You've got to clear the path. We're starting, Katie, now to talk about the discipline within the church, because he's saying you've got to clear the obstacles, the sinful men who are ensnaring you with the sin that so easily entangles. It sounds to me like this is a Christian church, but they've allowed a lot of unbelievers or Jewish people in who are having alternative voices within the very community. And they're causing people to stumble, and they're drawing people away. Okay? So, this is another section of that Proverbs 4:25. He says, let your eyes look straight ahead. Yeah, so this is the one section. Right? Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Make level paths for your feet and taking only ways that are firm. Does anybody notice in there anything that was a highlight at the beginning of this chapter? Yeah. Do you think he used that? And how did he use it? Yeah, fix your gaze on Jesus. So again, he's used this Proverbs passage and he's informed it. He's saying, if you fix your gaze, look straight ahead, he's saying the looking straight ahead is looking straight ahead to Jesus. That's how you fix your gaze. Right, so that's just a bit of extra that he's used these passages. He's used about the scourging, Proverbs 3, and that later part, and also the fixing your gaze from Proverbs 4. So you can see he's in that part of the world. Any thoughts or questions there before we move on? Okay, so the next, I won't, Badwell, could you do it for me, please? Could you read 14 to 17?
Make every effort to live in peace with all men and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one misses the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance right as the oldest son. Afterwards, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. He could bring about no change of mind, though he sought the blessing with tears.
Thank you. Okay, you see there that two of those verses start with, see to it that no one. See to it that no one, right? So this is an exhortation for the church, right? See to it that nobody in the church misses the grace. See to it that nobody in the church has got contempt for the covenant, as Esau did. Okay, so we've got a very clear covenant, the covenant that Jesus makes through the cross and resurrection. Don't see to it that there's no one in the church who has contempt for that. See to it that nobody in the church misses out on the grace. Do you see, this is a call to discipline within the church community. So let's have a look at this. First of all, with the NIV, I often have trouble with the NIV, but there's a slight discrepancy here. You see that I've got the NIV, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. Right? Now, the English Standard Version, strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. You see, the first one seems to indicate, get holy, and with that holiness you see the Lord. The second one seems to be suggesting, get the holiness that enables you to see the Lord, which is the holiness derived by faith, of course. You see, so there's a discrepancy there. Strive to be holy, that's the contrast, strive to be holy, or strive for the holiness necessary to see God. Do you see how these translations are so significant? And unfortunately, you can't look at one translation and say, oh, this one's got it all right, you know, because the differences are there. And some have it good, some have it bad, but it just takes a lot of work in there to see. And looking at the context of the whole section is very important. Okay, so he says, see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Now again, one of the things that we're doing in Hebrews is reflecting on its Old Testament roots, where he's getting his stuff from. And this again feeds into the notion of the corporate holiness. Okay, the corporate holiness. So, first of all, he says, see that no one is without or lacks the grace of God. In other words, see to it that no one is unsaved. Essentially, that's what's been said, right? And the second part, see to it that no poisonous root springs up or appears to cause trouble and ruin many. Okay, so that's that concept again. Make sure nothing's growing up in the church that's going to ruin other people. And there's a precedence for this. Can you see that? That's Deuteronomy 29:18. Make sure that there is no man or woman, clan or tribe among you today whose hearts turn away from Yahweh our God and go and worship the gods of other nations. Make sure is that there is no root among you that produces bitter poison. Can you see where he's got it from? So he's talking about the purification of Israel to make sure there's no dissenting voice against Yahweh. He's using that text now to say, make sure there's no dissenting voice within the church. That's what's causing the church to have the problems. You've got people who are influential, people who are respected, who don't hold to the core traditions. And they're enticing people away. That's what you've got to discipline. A shepherd has to keep the wolves out of the flock. You see? So that's why I say, Katie, it's all part of a corporate righteousness being unfolded here. So this is a warning about allowing unbelieving elements who are having an influence to remain in the church. As far as I'm concerned, anybody can be in the church, whether they believe or not. But if they try to have an influence, if they try to lull people away to another system, if they invite them to their home and say, listen, really the Christadelphian way is better. And we don't have all this confusion about the Trinity, I've known people like that who have been in churches and who did that. They went to a church and on Sundays they'd entertain people and tried to persuade them to leave the church. It's really sad, but that's what goes on. We've got to be on guard about that. And thankfully, Paul's really on the ball here. He collars anybody who walks in. Thank you, Paul. We don't always appreciate it, but you do a great job. So then this is even further elaborated. Okay, so then if that wasn't clear enough, he goes into it. See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. So now he's using Esau as the example. And Esau was both immoral and godless in regard to the covenant. Because remember, after the dispute with his father, he went and married an Egyptian woman, then he married a Canaanite woman, and he became a polygamist overnight. He was given to his appetites. So the point being that Esau lost his birthright, not because Jacob cheated him. See what the writer's saying here? Not because Jacob cheated him, but because he sold. For a single meal, he sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. He puts the blame squarely on Esau for losing the covenant. No blame for Jacob at all. He sold it. He had disregard for it. So see that no one among you has disregard for the covenant. See to it that nobody among you has disrespect for Jesus. See to it that no one among you is saying, oh, look, I can understand Jesus was a good man and a prophet and he said great things, but really, the eternal king of the universe, well, okay, hold that view, keep it to yourself. But if you want to start arguing with the congregation, sorry, we're here to worship Christ. We don't entertain alternative gods in this community. Okay, so again, you can see this this component of driving the church to purify itself. And when he speaks there of the immoral person, he's using the word pornos, where we got pornography from. And there's two layers to this, or a couple of layers. That is, with the Jews could appear to be, first century Jews could appear to be very moral in one respect. But one of the things that Jesus took on in the first century was the adultery. And when we say adultery, I mean sending away their wives. Remember, it was one of the issues in the Gospels, and they would come to Jesus and say, Moses said we can send away our wives for any reason at all. Right? That was their attitude. And so when we see the prostitutes in that ancient world, they were usually the wives of these men who had been sent away and had no wherewithal of support. And remember, in that ancient world, you could have more than one wife. But if you've got the old model and you're looking at the new model and you think, I don't want to put any more petrol in this old model, I just want the new one. And you've got this opportunity to cut that one adrift. That's what they were doing. And it was disgraceful. Sorry, is that misogynistic? Could be. I'm an old white man. I do this from time to time. But you see the point. That's what they were doing. And so this is something that is particularly important. And if we ever get to Hebrews 13, you'll find that there's 6 exhortations in Hebrews chapter 13. And those 6 exhortations all have to do with Judaism and the effect of it. So one of the first ones is the marriage bed should be pure. Right? Don't let the marriage bed be defiled. Why would he need to make this example? First up, because if you're a Christian and you're becoming a Jew, well then there is the opportunity to dump your wife. Because that's what was going on. We say, no, the marriage bed is not to be defiled. You make a commitment, you've got a bond. And you see, the covenant that a man and a woman makes when they marry, a violation of that is comparable, not the same circumstances, but comparable to the covenant that God makes with his people. And a rejection of that covenant. So if you break small covenant, you break big covenant. It used to be like with leaders, they used to say, oh, well, if you're not faithful in small things, you won't be faithful in big things. That's gone out the window. You can be as unfaithful as you like at any level of your life, and people don't think you're not going to be faithful in your big things. No, if you're unfaithful in small things, you're going to be unfaithful in big things. It's because it's your character. If you break covenant here, you break covenant there. And that's one of the reasons why Simeon and Levi were judged, because they broke the covenant that Abraham had made, that Jacob had made, a covenant of peace. They broke that covenant, and that was abominable to him and actually brought them under a curse. Okay, so I suspect that the immoral person here is somebody who is probably sending away his wife in order to get a new wife. The godless Esau is a model of foolish covenant breaker and, of course, driven by the flesh. His immediate comfort was more important than his long-term security. Again, very pointed for the Hebrews, who to be secure in the future is more important than having the comfort now. Remember all the guys in Hebrews 11? They were prepared to bear the brunt of shame, disrespect, persecution, living in caves, living as strangers and aliens. They could do all of that because they had their eye on the future. They say, in fact, the difference between middle-class people and lower-class people is that middle-class people have an eye on the future. They're able to save and make decisions that will secure their future. And often people who don't break out of other classes is because whatever they get, they just use. And they don't put stuff away and they don't make plans for the future. In a sense, we've got to be the higher class people who actually look to eternity and make that our place of investment. You see? It's driven by the thing that will really matter, where moth doesn't get in, where the rust doesn't destroy, you see, and where thieves don't break in. That's where you store up your treasure. That's where it's going to be really permanent. Okay? All right, so marriage and faith are linked here. Both are covenants which are being held in contempt. So the apostle wants us to see that it is such people. So the apostle wants us to see to it that such people are not in the church or influencing the church. Can you see how this is a corporate dimension? It's a corporate righteousness. Strengthen the ones who are weak, get rid of the ones who are making them weak, level the paths, get rid of the stumbling blocks that'll trip people up. You see, all of that. So it's really a chapter about disciplining the church, not just individuals. So that goes to the whole thing about, of course, as a church, you're probably going to suffer. That's going to happen. Now, I'm mindful of the time. It's 9:40, and I know we didn't get through this. And the next section is going to... So I'll try to finish 12 next week, and if Paul shows us grace, we might be able to pick up chapter 13 at the beginning of the next academic year. Is that okay, Paul, do you think? Maybe one or two, we'll see. We would have forgotten all about Hebrews by then, probably after the summer. So... No, I'm not working in July. Not during the week. We can do it on Saturday night or Friday. Okay, I'll pray and then we can go to prayer.
People work in July in church.
I know. Dear Lord, we thank you for your love. We thank you for your words of wisdom. We thank you for the apostle who wrote these words to us. Lord, that his wisdom is so great and guiding us. Lord, help us to apply the things that we are taught from this passage and guide us, and primarily to help us to fix our eyes on Jesus, who is our author and perfecter. And without him we have nothing. Help us not to be tripped up as we look to him and continue to walk in his direction. Guide us and strengthen us, we ask. For your name's sake, amen. Please spend some time in prayer.